think it's quite fitting that I'm a bit wet. It's miserable outside. The weather is humid. There was thunder echoing throughout the apartment a few moments ago, and now things are quiet. They're a bit silent, and I can't imagine a better way to end an evening than to gauge your mind. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I think it's the way Beirut works. I ran into you at the photography fair in Suq al-Tayyib, must be 2 weeks ago or so, and you just sort of appeared. We were talking to mutual friends, and it sort of made sense to me that I shouldn't wait until March 14 next year to ask you to join the podcast. Thought if anything, maybe this time of the year is the right time of the year. Not because of celebration or joy. I think it's the opposite end. Commemorations of assassinations, not one but multiple. Things that look very bleak in Lebanon. Today I think the lira hit 28,000. Nothing is right in this country. And I think it's fine to still talk about a moment that both of us are very, very proud of. And I think it's a moment that is being misinterpreted over time. So why don't we reflect on March 14? This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, the Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is the Beirut Banyan. We all went through the Syrian occupation together, but for me, the one moment that I thought was magic, pure magic, was March 14, and it was seeing a country waking up from a slumber, and it was the Lebanon that I really wanted to see all along. So if we can tie that in, maybe, to what you thought of March 14 as it was building up, and the people that inspired you from March 14. Gibran Twaini's assassination, the anniversary was 2 days ago. We have Francois Hajj as well. Was it today or yesterday? Yesterday.
We have Muhammad Shattah on the 27th.
My father on the 27th. So these are all people that either had a relationship to March 14.
We have Pierre in November, not a long time ago.
Just a few weeks ago. And there's many more.
And of course, Samir and Walid.
Sure.
And Antoine and
maybe I can ask you,
Sam.
What did March 14 mean to you?
You know, Ronnie, I've always said, I've obviously been asked a lot on the subject of March 14th. I always try to bring it back to how it really happened. First of all, there'll always be a me before March 14th and a me after March 14th. And I think anyone who was... I'm not talking about politicians and I'm not talking about political parties. Those of us who were just there for 65 days, many of us were not from a political party. And at least our group, who's a group, we called ourselves Al-Mujtama Al-Madani because we were not a political party, and that's why we called ourselves Amam. And we sort of met in the streets. So, Nicole and I were friends, but I met Khadr in the streets, and I met Farid Fakhreddin in the streets, and I met Nabil Abu Sharaf, whom I didn't know very well, in the streets, and then I met Edmond Rabat in the streets, and then I met Inas Fakhreddin and Khadr Mekkewi, and then we coalesced, and Shadi Ayyash, who came from Akkar, and these were all people who felt they wanted to be there, but did not belong to a political party, and we sort of became a group.
Yeah.
And I always say that had there not been March 14th, I don't think Asma Andraos would have dared marry Nazih Yassin from Tabbani.
I see. Okay.
It broke down. I lived it, right? So this was not something I was watching on television. This was not something I read about. And this is not something I like to intellectualize. I'm not an intellectual. I always say that. And I'm not a politician. I like politics.
Few people that would disagree with you on both sides.
I don't dream of being an MP or a minister or a director general in a ministry. I have an issue with systems generally. A bit of a rebel ever since I was at school. So I'm better off as a free electron. And actually, we'll come back to that, but when your father came to my tent, because I had a tent, and he introduced himself, and of course I had no idea who he was.
So this is in the summer of 2005?
No, this is... he was here for a few days towards the end of it, just before the Syrians left.
Oh, so this is really just after March 14th?
Yeah, this is sort of sometime in April.
Oh, of course, yeah. There was a short trip, I remember.
Very short.
Yes, of course.
All I know is I'm sitting in my tent, and Shadi Ayash, who was our tent keeper, says to me, and I think Shadi knew who Muhammad was, I had no idea. And he said to me, في بده يحكي معك دكتور محمد شطح أو السفير محمد شطح. I can't remember what he said. And I said, مين يعني? And he made a funny face like, Asma, pull yourself together, you should know this, right? And so because I trusted Shadi, I went out and we went for coffee.
Okay.
And he said he'd seen me on television and then on CNN, and that he was very curious to meet me, and that if he was coming back, he would very much like me to work with him. And I said, but I'm very flattered, but you are aware I am. I'm not good at Arabic. Look at me, I remember I was wearing pink Converse shoes. I said, look at me, I'm wearing pink Converse shoes and an oversized jumper.
That's exactly what we're looking for.
And that, he said.
Oh, really? Is that what he said?
That's exactly what I'm
looking for. Are you serious?
I swear to God.
Oh, shit. Now I feel like I've done something.
He said, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
You're kidding me.
And so that's how I got into the Serai. And I said, I'm not politically correct. How am I going to learn how to tone down? He said, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. We'll find ways. And I said, I have a business. I have an events business. I don't want to stop my business. Right. He said, we'll figure out ways.
I'm just sorry to interrupt, but there's a lot of magic happening before March 14th.
Yeah, the whole month leading to it.
The whole month. And
I'll tell you what happened is that suddenly you had in one space an agora of people who had not been engaged in dialogue ever, really, because these were people who were all younger than we were. We were the oldest tent. So that's why we became also the link between them all, and we became the sort of providers, because we were the only ones who were not a political party, because we were from very different sects, if one can call. I mean, we had Khadr, I think, is Sunni, and Farid and Walid are Druze, I think. And there was, it was our tent was very sort of.
But I vividly remember this, although your memory of it is probably more intimate, because you spent, if not every day, almost every day.
I spent every day.
Every day.
So. Every day for 64 days. I went back home when the Syrians withdrew.
Right. So
into
that's
Syria.
April 14, 15? 23?
23, 26, comme ça.
So you knew the street well for 2 months. If you can look back now, there's two huge questions, and we can let this sort of steer the conversation. Before we get into really the most important part, I think, of March 14, which was the minds of March 14, not the politicians.
They didn't kill the politicians. They killed the minds.
So that's exactly. So well said. Did you sense that the divide over Syria's influence in Lebanon, which we did not think of back then as maybe Hezbollah was involved. We really sort of went all the way with Syria. And we didn't think of Hezbollah the way we think of that group today. But there was a divide already. I mean, 3 weeks in, we had March 8.
Thank God we did.
No, but sorry, I'll just... So one part of this question is, did you already... I mean, we're going back in time now. This is hindsight. Did you feel that there's a sectarian component to this story that is beyond your control? And another thing, I remember, of course, I mean, we were all of us, across the political spectrum, from Shabab Mustaqbal to Tayar Watan al-Hur. Aoun is in Paris, Jaja is in jail. We're all doing the Uwait claps together. I mean, it's not about Uwait either, it's about unity. It wasn't about Jaja, it was about all of us turning the page. So these are things you can never let go of. Whatever you think about Uwait, or whatever you think about any of these groups, people were imitating each other in a way that was unusual, very unusual. Do you think that was part of the problem? That we let what ends up becoming the worst part of March 14, which I think maybe is what you were hinting at earlier, we let the politicians guide.
Yes. I always say there's a moment when they take over, and that's pretty much when March 14th as a spirit or as an essence dissolves. And that leads to Al-Ittifaq al-Ruba'i and to all those sorts of absurdities just after.
So March 14th is really the earlier...
Which is why I always say, please, there has to be a distinction. And again, don't misunderstand me. I wouldn't like anyone to think that what I'm about to say now means that I'm one of the Kullun Yani Kullun. I'm not one of the Kullun Yani Kullun.
We'll go into this, yeah.
For me, it's not everyone is the same, and those who kill are not the same as those who get killed. But and there are those who kill, and there are those who get killed.
I want to. We'll get into Kullun.
But to go back to that, there was definitely a soul, a ruh, something. To this day, I can't define it. There was something in the air. It was magic. It was. We were suddenly friends with people we would normally never be friends with. I went into people's homes and villages all over Lebanon, people who are not only from different confessions, that in Canada I learned was irrelevant, but from very different social backgrounds, from very different... There was something broke then. Something... I think we really nearly became one. Sadly, there was a missing component. You just brought it up. To be fair, what we saw on 8th March was, to me, alien. I couldn't believe that anyone could thank Syria for anything. To me, I just couldn't relate to that at all. It was, to this day, I can't. Yani, it baffles me that they could say thank you, baffled me. That suddenly we became two camps scared me. Because I felt that when I saw this 8th of March scene, why I say thank God they did is because I think that it made it much easier for us to mobilize on March 14th.
It created March 14. I don't think there would have been a March 14.
For sure.
And actually that was the whole thing. There would
have been a March 14 because we organized a march every week on the same day.
Yes,
and March 14 happened to be one of those days. But it would have never been so huge.
The way we think about it. Yeah, absolutely.
It couldn't have.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I said thank God they did. Thank God they did, because it gave way to this response, which was a response of color and life.
Sure. And not just 1 month after Hariri's assassination, it was a rejection of thanking Syria.
Absolutely.
So
but for me, how could we thank Syria, even not just because of Rafiq Hariri, because of everything else, the wars, the dead, the torture, the executions, the prisons, the bourrivage, the masjid,
There's two things here I want to ask you, and it's come up on the podcast several times, and I think it's better that someone else offers analysis, not me. I want to... You're on the street, you're living this moment, and you see a counter-protest that's fairly large. It's not just 10,000 or 100,000.
No, it was big.
Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese that are showing up thanking Bashar al-Assad and thanking the Syrian army after they're implicated in killing Rafiq Hariri.
But not only, right?
And they're also...
And Ghanem Awad and Bashir Jmail and Mufti Khalid
and it's 30...
And wars.
It's almost 30 years of Syrian involvement in Lebanese affairs.
Occupation, really, no?
Yeah, I mean, 15 years of actual occupation, another 15 or so, a little less maybe, of military involvement. So that's 3 decades of this needs to end. And then you have a counter-protest that says, if it's ending, at least we're going to thank them on their way out. So it's primarily, and I really despise looking at it this way, but that's the way it's brought up, and maybe that is the only way to talk about it. It becomes a sectarian issue. Even when the protesters are not sectarian.
Absolutely. Thank you. I was going to say exactly that.
Yeah, so like you and the way you described it is like all of Lebanese that want to end the Syrian nightmare are on the streets.
Yeah.
And then you have what is turning.
And there's hope, right? And there's
Yeah.
love, and there's joy, and there's not one incident, there's
Yeah.
not one slap, not one mashkal. These people have never spoken before.
Yeah.
The young Dirzi had never spoken to a young Christian because his father and this father had fought for years.
Is there anything
And
though is there anything in that window that was missed in terms of trying to
Maybe there was in
Yeah.
hindsight. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that.
that
Did we voluntarily leave anyone out? No. Did
we'll go back.
I've always asked myself.
We'll go back to this later. Sorry, I'm being rude here. I'm interrupting you.
No, you're supposed to do that.
17 Tishrin, whether you like it or not, we'll get into it later.
No,
but
it's not that I don't like it. It's just that I was not part of it.
okay, you're not part of it, but give them credit that they willingly went out of their way to try to
Absolutely.
bring
Absolutely.
up to the ring.
My mother was there every day.
Yeah. And Harakat Amal or Hezbollah, that's not important. You're Lebanese, you're going to protest with us, we're all one and the same. That I saw was genuine. That's real effort. Whether or not it succeeded is something else. The build up to March 14, do you think it's because we did not really know that it was Hezbollah? That we were still looking at Syria and not Hezbollah? That we didn't really own how big of a problem Hezbollah was going to become?
I did, because I remember saying that on television back then. I had an issue with Hezbollah as of 2000. Many people did. 2000 Israelis withdraw from Lebanon. To someone like me, incomprehension sets in as to why Hezbollah are still the only armed group in Lebanon as of 2000. So if they were there to push the Israelis out, well done, they did it. And then I started having a serious issue and many questions in my mind as to why they were still so armed.
But it wasn't on your mind on the streets between February and March 2005.
I kept saying ما بدنا جيش بلبنان إلا جيش لبنان. So I guess something was there.
Yeah.
But like you said, I don't think I had imagined. It's funny, I never thought about it before, that Hezbollah were part of the Rafi Hariri assassination. I think to us, mostly it was the Syrians.
Yeah.
But because as of 8th March, I started wondering.
Right.
Because I thought, why would a group do that?
Yeah.
Why would they actually make it a point? And as you said, an impressive point. So it was not like 20 people who have an opinion. This was people in their thousands saying thank you. And then we started being invited on television plateaus together. Young people from both sides.
Yes, of course.
So you had people from the political parties on the 8th, political parties on the 14th. Then you had people like me who were 14 marchers but not political parties.
Right.
And you had the same like me on the March 8th scope. And then I remember thinking, we're going to have a serious issue. We don't.
The reason I'm mentioning this group in particular back then is because that is the group responsible for ending March 14, not through persuasion or politics or...
No, through physical violence and political violence and succession of assassinations. This is my answer to anyone who says, where are the March 14 minds?
Okay,
Where they were killed. One after the other. They were assassinated. It was a very clear plan and executed to perfection to amputate March 14 camp from any brain, charismatic figure, potential actor for change or for political change, a rallier beyond sectarian lines. So people like Pierre Jmeil, who could have provided a new, fresh blood to Christians. People like Gibran and Samir, who across sects had that kind of charisma to get people to dream of something different. People, and he's your father, you know him better than I do. I always say this, it's not because you're here. I've rarely met someone so intelligent as Muhammad Shattah, before or since. They didn't pick Muhammad par hasard. They did not pick anyone haphazardly. They knew for each person why they were taking them out. They were taking out anyone who could actually reach out to a larger group of people than their small community, and to anyone who could be heard and be an inspiration for locals, diaspora, and the West, and the Arabs. And they made sure to amputate us from all those. So now when they ask where they are, well, they killed them.
So I'm going to say something. There's nothing you said that I disagree with. Everything you said is true. And anyone that touches their security domain,
they will destroy it.
Yeah. So there's nothing you said that can even be challenged.
Some people do challenge it, I'm sure. But
okay, without going into conspiracy,
like it could be Israel and it could be I don't know what.
Without going,
and then they tried to tell us that Pierre Jmeil, it was Palestinians who came down from Ruwaisit, all sorts of bizarre theories.
Right, but let's say all of this is true, okay? And I'm going to do my best here to detach myself from this whole thing.
I'm sorry, yes.
No. This problem of political assassinations by one group that destroyed a movement is obvious. Michel Aoun leaves March 14 in June of 2005. The son of Rafiq Hariri, within weeks of being comfortable enough to admit that the Syrians may be involved, took him time. It's not something that they were quick to own up to. Actually, I think it was March 14 where that group suddenly was able to say it outright.
It was very much and very often we preceded politicians. So, we forced them to say certain things and we pushed them to do certain things.
Exactly. So let's say there's a political change within March 14 that happens before the long string of assassinations. I think it coincides really with when Samir Asir is killed, and that summer. March 14 is something else. It's the old politics that were more familiar under the Syrian occupation era. You have Mustaqbal, which is now a new party, more comfortable with Hezbollah than Michel Aoun in terms of politics.
Was it Mustaqbal?
You have a prime minister of this country, Fouad Senora, who's comfortable.
Yeah, but do we know who? Do we remember?
No, but I'm saying this as somebody who knows that how vicious Hezbollah was. And it's not a long time later. I mean, it's days after the July War in 2006 that there's permanent paralysis on the streets of Lebanon.
Which leads us to Doha.
Sure. So that whole story is known.
Union Nationale that never works and all of this.
I'm really looking at the first stages of March 14.
I always ask myself who convinced Hariri, who was a young,
in his late 30s?
He wasn't even 40.
Yeah.
He had nothing to do with politics. And we know how it works in Lebanon, so people who say, well, he should have said no, that's not quite how it works, unfortunately. Who convinced him that Michel Aoun was so dangerous?
Well, this is what I'm looking back at now.
I always ask this question. I have a few answers. I don't have any of my own. I'm often told it's... let's not go down that route because it's... I always ask myself, had Michel Aoun stayed on our side, wouldn't have things been very, very different?
I think the damage done to March 14 would have been less.
For sure.
And I think
because
Michel,
I also always ask myself, sorry, Ronnie, I'm cutting you off here, but could Hezbollah be who they are if they were not backed by a strong Christian political party?
Oh, they need not just that. They need, I think, Hariri.
So
too.
imagine if they didn't have Michel Aoun.
But then the question is, why is Hezbollah treated as politics as normal within months, and Aoun is on his own sort of expedition to get favors from Hezbollah. There's something wrong in the immediate aftermath of March 14. I'm going to ask you, and this is a way to tie it to October 17 in a way.
There's something wrong in the immediate aftermath of Taif. You take out. I don't want to go into specifics because war is contextual, right? But and I come from a place where I know how much that is true. But how logical? I mean, ask that to a 10-year-old child. Is it to imagine building a new something, because obviously the war was a disaster, and taking the very people who did the war, giving them suits and ties, except for Hariri, right? Because he had nothing to do with the war, and saying, okay, now you guys, you're no longer bad people who did the war, you're now clean politicians who are going to rule the country. And Macron tried to do exactly the same again now on August 4th.
Yeah.
So the problem actually goes way before March 14th. The problem is we have an intrinsic system failure. I think this is something we need to acknowledge. I'm sure most Lebanese acknowledge this in and out. I mean, let's face it. We have no electricity. We're on the verge of having no internet. We clap when we get a couple of hours of electricity in a row.
Yeah.
Our hospitals are going down the drain. Our universities are going down the drain. Our school system is going down the drain.
Yeah.
Inflation is insane. Unemployment is rampant. Today, like you said earlier, the lira the dollar hit 28,000.
Yeah.
There is a system collapse. It's a system failure. Now, are we going to take the same people who've been pretty much involved in the past 40 years and ask them to fix it? I mean, you would be either totally unintelligent.
Of course, but your analogy of Ta'if, I think I understood it slightly differently. That you have the end of the civil war, but groups that do not work with the Syrians are phased out.
Yeah.
So Tayyar Watan al-Hur is based in Paris. Al-Uwait al-Libnani is based in jail. All the other groups that are now forgotten are exiled, or they're just out of the picture.
So back then it was you had to work with the Syrians.
Right.
Now you have to work with Hezbollah or the Iranians. If not, you're out.
So, but in March 14 and then June 20, whatever it was, the summer election.
That's when politics took over. It's a disaster that.
Yeah,
that's when they did the Amal Hezbollah Mustaqbal.
This is what I'm talking about. For me, I can't understand why groups that were embracing...
Because they went into the very basic and tiny, teeny mathematical count of elections and electoral...
So is it fair to say that
pretty much like the same reason why some parties much later on went into this heresy of this orthodox law, just because they get 4 more here and 2 more there, and...
So this is the bigger question then. Would you say that the politics of March 14 died in mid-2005, but the aspirations survived through intelligentsia, not through politicians?
Very true.
Okay.
And then what happened? That intelligentsia got killed.
Yeah.
So what's left?
I'd like to own something. I want to be strong enough to at least admit that as much as I embraced that moment and I thought it was good for Lebanon, that there's something wrong when most Lebanese Shia
are outside it.
And they don't have to be, I mean, Hezbollah can say something, but if they believe it, they'll show up on the street. And some did, not enough.
Some did.
Not
especially
enough.
Those that are from more leftist backgrounds. They were there. And we had a few groups that are Shia. I won't say his name. He had to leave Lebanon, but because he was very threatened. But he was there for the 64 days with 10 people.
Right. So there's small, but it's not enough.
No, of course not. The large chunk of the Shia community was in the other camp. And I think that's why also we failed.
There's something wrong when you can't get them to come over naturally against that they're willing to take the risk that they didn't take. And something else. I'm not a Christian Lebanese. I'll never know what it's like to have to think about, am I more Aune or Uweje?
You can be neither nor.
Or Kataib or whatever.
Or neither nor. Or you can be just a Lebanese,
sure,
sovereignist, Christian person
but I'll never
who
know.
believes that their country deserves to be free and
Yes.
sovereign and independent, and who believes that the people of Lebanon deserve a life, whether they're Shia, Sunni, Hezbollah, Amal, Ishtiraki, Kataib, Uwait, Aouniye, or none of the above. They all are without electricity, all of them.
But
So we're all in trouble.
Sure. But I think what I meant was, I'll never know what it's like to have this double problem, which is the Syrian occupation that is targeting one community more
Of
than
course.
others. And when it's out, when the Assad regime is leaving, the inertia takes you to Hezbollah, which means that there's an insecurity there that March 14 did not or could not.
I don't think it did not, thank you. It could not. This is very intrinsic, I think, to our... You asked me a question earlier. We have to accept that Lebanon is a very complex country, right? We have to understand that we're not like our Gulf neighbors because of this variety of sects, whether one likes it or not. So we're all terrified of each other. And Christians maybe were all terrified more because we know that numerically we're less and less, and because our lifestyle is at stake. And that's why a lot of Christians are leaving Lebanon. And that's why they've been leaving in big numbers since the last century's early years. So,
and in the post-Civil War, in numbers that are huge.
Scary, of course, because it has to do with lifestyle stability, the possibility of projecting oneself into the future, and a lot of other stuff. It has to do with, I think, also with other stuff that's more cultural. But I tend, like you, to feel that that's not sectarian.
There's regional dynamics. There's a lot of problems.
We forget, right? Yeah. So we can't ever be... It's not as easy as ruling Egypt or the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, or Iran, because these are countries where one sect is very predominant. So it's pretty easy. And also the governance system is clear. There's one person who decides and then everything gets executed. I'm not anymore very convinced of our system. It's a capacity to rule itself.
But it's just that I remember these conversations with somebody who was so anti-Syria, becoming sympathetic to Hezbollah very quickly, and March 14 was something that was almost transitory, that it's not something that they would believe in itself, which I thought is odd. You can't go that far unless there's an insecurity that's not addressed.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
I think we failed to address those fears. But also, I think that the political game that ensued, la politique politicienne, I'm not sure how you say that in English, like what I call small petty politics. Turned Hezbollah into the super monster it is today. Allowed it to become this superpower. This state within the state, this army, this organization, this Captagon exporters, this and producers, this rogue, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's very simple. Anyone who doesn't agree is going to get killed, right? Lokman Slim was killed not a long time ago. How dangerous is Lokman? What Lokman reads and writes, right? Lokman doesn't know how to hold a gun. Like, Lokman is like Muhammad Shatah couldn't have killed a fly. He used to find me very violent, which I am, but I can be. But these are people of peace and word. These are people of mind and thought. These are people of ideas. Samir Asir, Muhammad Shatah, Lokman Slim, Jabran Twaini, these are not warriors. They're not fighters. So today I always ask myself, what option is Hezbollah giving us? What's their plan?
Well, actually, so I'm going to get into this, but in a different way, because I think there's the basics are very... I've had my time to share that sentiment, and I think it stands exactly where you are, which is you cannot build a country with an armed proxy militia that eliminates reformists and people that believe in the state
or anyone who disagrees with them,
or anyone that touches on their security in a way that is meant to bring Lebanon to peace rather than perpetual war. But all of that understood. You spend 12 years in a way like it's an advisory role.
True.
Maybe on your terms, maybe.
No, but that's what it was.
With somebody who's lost a lot of political capital and may not be able to return in any political shape or form. It's perhaps too soon to say that outright, but at least for the time being, it's unthinkable to imagine Saad Hariri being prime minister again anytime soon, or even let alone MP. And it's also, I think it's at this stage, it's at least possible that the future party may close its doors. So that is, I think, happening. Maybe that's a little too bleak. But you were either alongside my father, or maybe sometimes you longer than him. You worked in that, what was left of March 14 in a political capacity, and it seemed already that it was past its prime, that the intelligentsia we both know were already killed. You had remnants of March 14 lingering on. And March 14 got a bad reputation in those years. And I don't think it's fair to put the aspirations of March 14 and Saad Hariri's survivability in the same story. They're two different stories. But there is somebody fully associated with March 14 who is then making these strange national unity deals with Gibran Bassil and Michel
Did he have much choice? I'm not sure. I resigned, to be fair, in 2017.
You left in 2017. So
I
before,
left just when there was the tatwiyah, they call it.
Yeah.
To me, it looked like too much of a bazaar.
Yeah.
And I'm not one to very much like bazaars.
Yeah.
And I felt that we were coming to something like 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I could feel it, right?
Yeah.
I could sense it. I have a particular trait to my personality. I have friends from very different walks of life and from very different political spectrums. I actually have friends from pretty much everywhere. Pro Amal, pro Hezbollah, pro Shuyu'iyya. I'm a right-wing person.
You married a Tabani resident?
I'm a strange sort of. I have very different groups. From very different generations. I have friends that are 20 years younger than I am. I have friends that are 30 years older than I am, and I could feel that something was about to explode. I could sense that we were coming on to. Of course, I had no idea it was going to be anything like October 2019, but I felt that there was a real disconnect between people across the political spectrum and their actual leaders. And of course all the others who don't believe that any of those can lead them anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Just very quickly to go back to Saad Hariri, and I'm not going to dwell on that much. I hope those listening to us will forgive me. I actually love Saad. He's a friend. He's like a brother. I cannot publicly say what I objectively think of him, but that's between me and me.
Oh, right.
It's not like anyone would stop me. I don't think Saad was very successful politically. I don't think, honestly, any of the current political class were successful politically. We wouldn't be here if there were.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Saad was cut for politics. I'm not sure Saad had a choice either. People tend to forget that the only reason he was put in those shoes at a very young age and with hardly any knowledge of the Lebanese political palaver was because his father was killed. And he wasn't killed because he fell on a banana peel. He was killed because they blew up large amounts of explosives to make sure he was killed. But
there's something about not resigning earlier that made me very uncomfortable with his longevity. That there's something, and you left in 2017?
Yes, I left in 2017. I told him while I was leaving.
But I'm guessing the feeling of wanting to leave was predating 2017.
I wanted to leave after your father was killed.
Okay, so that's at least 4 years earlier.
I hang on because, again, like I said, it was my house, this also. It's a place where I felt home. It's a person on a human level that I love, Saad. People who know him personally will all tell you the same thing. He is a lovely person. I didn't feel it would be right to abandon. I could feel it was a ship that was not faring very well, and the way I think and the way I function says you don't leave people when they're...
Yeah.
But then at one point it became a real issue for me, not Saad Hariri and not Mustaqbal, the entire thing became for me just...
No, I think actually, if anything, the leadership role, he should have been able to relieve a lot of people of that pressure and resigned earlier. I think his reputation would have been more intact. But the reason I'm bringing him up...
But I also think, and I think this will come in time, people will realize that he will leave much more of a void than people think. Because I know you don't think that way, but that's, at the end of the way, Lebanon is cut off that way. There's going to be a serious problem with Sunni leadership.
Oh, I actually had this conversation before we started recording.
Saad Hariri...
He is still the natural Sunni leader of Lebanon.
Because people need a leader, right?
I agree.
And because, I repeat, he's a lovable person. And because, and that's very important, especially for non-Sunnis, he's a very moderate.
I'm not trying to make this about him in particular.
No, and for me it's very difficult to be objective about him. I mean, I admit that he is somebody I love daily, and when you love someone daily, you can't be very objective.
But I'm going
it's the way it is.
I'll ask it because it's become so hard to keep March 14 in an optimistic... there's so much hatred towards March 14 that comes from places that it shouldn't come, and this can be from other forms of intelligentsia, could be from journalists, could be from politicians, or could come sometimes from October 17. I'm wondering whether or not Saad Hariri, because of his decision to stay longer than he should, and because not just leading up to October 17, but trying to come back again.
But let me challenge that, Ronnie. In effect, like I said, I wasn't in the streets, I told you earlier, during the October...
I had to divorce him from March 14 in order to be able to think of him in an objective way. Because
but I have a question. This whole October, who did it kick out other than Saad Hariri? They're all there, right? And they're fine. And no one's bothering them. And they ain't going nowhere.
He resigned.
Why only him?
Oh, that's of course. Actually,
I always ask that. So, was the objective of this October thing Saad Hariri? Well, then, bravo. And
but my question then is.
No, the question is not to you.
No,
my question is to en general. So this whole thing about كلهم يعني كلهم and we want them all out and blah blah. Would anyone dare?
So before we jump into Kilo Yani Kilo, because I'll wrap it up with that. I really want to know. I want to know your.
I'm just saying that basically this whole October movement managed to get Saad Hariri out the way, keep everybody else in place.
But when it comes to...
And are we better off?
When it comes to the reputation of March 14, I don't know why Saad Hariri came back after he resigned. Again, he resigns in November 2019. He spends most of 2020 and 2021 trying and failing
to form a government.
And that is not just crushing his own reputation. It's not just hurting him. It's not just putting him in the Emirates for maybe the remainder of his life. Who knows? He may not come back in a political capacity again. But it also destroys, I think, the people that really stood by March 14's principles. It hurts them as well. Maybe unintentional. They may not even be in the thought process. But all these people that paid the ultimate price, and those that also are still alive, that pursued March 14, took a hit. And I don't think
anyone didn't take a hit. Did March 8 not take a hit? Is Hezbollah doing okay today?
That's true, but you don't... Saad Hariri is... The fact that he was still trying less than 3 months ago, and then thinking back to why he became prime minister, or thinking back to why he was even on the news in February 2005, they're two completely different stories. I can't help but... If I do not divorce him from March 14, then I cannot be March 14. So I've struggled with this, and I found a way to compartmentalize him.
I've taken all politicians out of my March 14th equation. All of them. Honestly. Because it was a lot to do with people. It was a lot to do with people like me and those around me and plenty of others and nearly 1 million others.
Yep.
And we had nothing to do with politicians.
Right.
And half of us were not in political parties. And even those who were in political parties, I don't think they waited for their political leader to tell them to go hit the streets. I really think something spontaneous, extraordinary happened. And it just did, right? And every week we would see more numbers and larger crowds on that day because we organize protests weekly. So I always like to say there's the March 14th of people like me, and there are plenty of us, plenty. And there's the March 14th, the political March 14th. And they sort of managed to destroy it, if anything, because of strange political coalitions and little calcul of how many seats are you going to get into parliament, and if you're going to get a cut of the deal of the telecom or of the highway or of the, whatever it is, this pie-sharing disaster that has led us to where we are. That's one thing.
And the brave politicians were killed.
The brilliant minds, those who could actually provide an alternative for the future, and I'm convinced of that, were killed.
Yes.
To make sure that we're not allowed an alternative for the future. That's why we're stuck.
Yeah.
Why did the October 2019 movement, which I don't agree with necessarily because I'm not an anti-establishment person, because I am the establishment, or part of the establishment. That's one thing. The other thing is I have an issue with Kullun Yani Kullun, so that's the other thing. But why did that fail? We'll go back to that. But why did it fail? Because the system is stronger. Why did March 14 fail? Because the system is sick. Why did the people who got killed get killed? Because they were a hope of an alternative system. That's my opinion. That's how I see it,
so
right?
Let's try to link you up with what you want and the aspiration of a protester on the street. Not October 17 in the political minds of what we're seeing today, not the Shelb al-Nahas versus
Because
Kataib
I have
story.
an issue with all this leftist rhetoric, this neo-communist, whatever. To be fair, I've always been very honest about who I am, and like you said when I first got here, I'm not known to be very politically correct, right? So for someone like me, who comes from let's call it the way it is, a fairly bourgeois family, who comes from the Christian right, if one wants to sort of vulgarize it and sum it down to that. But although I don't think I am that, right? I'm just saying that, let's say, right? I'm not an anarchist at all, and I have an issue with, comment on va dire, la left, me.
Let me
so
try.
That's me.
Actually, I'm going to try to do something that I don't know if I can. I'm going to try to assume that you can be Kataib, a right-wing nationalist, or a bourgeois.
I'm very happy to represent the Kataib today, but I'm not Kataib.
No,
right?
Sorry.
I vote into Banyan, just so you know. Sadly, I can't even vote for Sami anymore. That's actually...
Sorry, then if you're to Banyan, I should say...
Because I would have voted for Sami had I been able to.
If you're to Banyan, then I should say...
I'm either Mi'ati or Hariri or Safadi or that's Okarami. That's who I'm allowed to vote for.
Worse, you can be Uwaji.
Again, not.
So let's assume that Sabatash Tishrin in principle is a spontaneous uprising.
Lovely in principle.
Okay, so similar to the protests that build up to March 14th.
And I could feel that, yes? But that's where the first 2 months, the first 2 to 3 months. It's when you also had, I'm sorry, I know it's totally unrelated, but you had a queer movement in the street during those 3 months. There was something like a freedom, an end of the system, let's break it up. The Berri people were in the streets the first 3 months, right? They came on them little scooters, and I remember my mother used to cheer them. And she used to say, Ijo, Ijo. And so...
Hezbollah supporters were on the
streets. So everyone was on the streets the first 3 months, until the politicians quickly collected their people, correct? So those left the streets. The Uwait and the Auni and who at first had spontaneously gone down to actually say, we have a problem with our authority too. Yeah. So I respect that. For me, I had 2 issues with that whole thing. The Kullun Yani Kullun, again, for the same reasons we've been discussing for the past hour. لا مش كلهم يعني كلهم. في مين يقتل وفي مين يقتل ومش نفس الشيء.
Can I ask you then, and I'm not going to try to challenge this, but it's hard to do it, but removing violence from that equation, there is obviously one group that is conducting assassinations. There is one group that can implement violence in a way that other groups can't. There is one army that is not the army. There aren't other competing armies. There's one army backed by a very important regional player that can compete with the Lebanese army.
So how can the Ahrar and them be the same?
No, but let's say that is true. When it comes to every other issue that we have dealt with.
Give me an example.
Okay, so Paul Salem recently, I hope I get this right. He has these sort of capital S sovereignty state, which we don't have. Clearly we don't have it. And then we have that smaller S, which is the system, the day-to-day affairs that are not necessarily Hezbollah's direct prerogative.
Can I give you a little example?
I'll just finish, hold on. Sorry to do this. They are definitely not helping improve the situation for anybody. Corruption and paralysis and stagnation are a direct consequence of having a constant war in this country. I agree with this. But when it comes to the rest of the political parties that sort of adjusted to the Syrians, and to Hezbollah, would you then say it is killun yani killun?
If you get rid of the weapons, we talk again.
Okay, so it's...
And even then,
are
the Uwait as corrupt as the others?
These are things that are worth asking. I don't think the recent ministers
of the
Lebanese forces were as corrupt. Are
the Kataib since 2005 and all the governments they've taken part in corrupt like the others? I'm not sure. In the political parties that are accused of corruption, is everyone corrupt? I don't think so.
Okay,
So then, let me just say, once you get rid of the weapons, that's my take on things. Of course, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of the weapons ourselves, because if there's one thing I'm totally against, it's war. Right? I'm not somebody, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm just saying that with this current Hezbollah version, there is no Lebanon possible. That's my opinion. And I'll give you a silly little example. When they come to give me a fine, or when the Maliye calls me to discuss something silly about my taxation, you know what my immediate answer is? Can you do that in Dahiya? Can you go into is any company registered in Dahiya? None. Do they pay taxes, import taxes? No, they don't, but the other merchants do. And this. So let's not, they can't, if we cannot all be subject to the same rule of law, there's no nation possible. You know that, I know that, right? So, weapons, sovereignty, therefore, army sovereignty, independent judiciary, which then will allow us proper investigations into everything, corruption included. And then let the judiciary decide if Ronnie Shattah and Asma Andraos are corrupt or not, and if whoever are corrupt or not. To this day, we've never, ever been able to have a local answer to any of the crimes that have driven the past 60 years of this country's bloody history. You said it yourself once, I heard you say it. How many pages are there in Muhammad Shattah's file? 0. How many in Gibran Twaini's file? 2.
Oh, 2, okay. That's
Pierre, 0.
Okay, that 2 is...
Or 2, I think somebody said that. Maybe Misha and Naila will say 0. I don't know. Same for René Mawad. August 4th. Where do we stand today? The city was raped. Every single one of us was raped. People died. They lost limbs and children and siblings and homes. Our city, your neighborhood, looks like a ghost neighborhood. We don't have one single answer yet. Not one. All of these, why did we have to go to La Haye and pay hundreds of millions of dollars to find out? And in the end, it was like you said, I listened to you yesterday, it wasn't particularly, I think it was a disappointment to most. But why did we have to have an international investigation? Because we're not capable of having a real investigation in Lebanon. So then maybe once we're rid of the Hezbollah issue, not of Hezbollah, right? Of the actual issue, which is this version of Hezbollah. You may not remember, but I was old enough to remember. The Uwait, when they were armed, were not the Uwait today.
Of course.
They were terrifying.
Of course.
If you were living
Yes,
in their
of course.
regions and not with them, my father was one of those people, your car would get damaged daily.
Yeah,
Your
of
tires
course.
would get punctured.
Of course.
Your store would get whatever. You would have a
Absolutely.
piece of paper. Okay.
Yeah.
Then the weapons were removed. They became a political party. If you and I are going to have this conversation and you have a huge gun here, will I feel as comfortable talking to you?
I always make this point that the whole point is to turn Hezbollah into another rotten political party, and all of us should then take on the very long and dirty and very difficult journey of reform together.
Voila.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm trying to find...
And then, yes,
Yeah.
if we get to that, I'll be fine with actually... I still have issues with the Kulon Yani Kulon because I don't really think in the Kulon Yani Kulon, but I'll be fine with the Kulon Yani Kulon. But first of all, let they all be equal. For all of them to be equal, one of them has to give up the status of super militia.
I agree. There's something about March 14.
I have also, last point,
please.
because I was thinking about this earlier today. كيف كلهم يعني كلهم? Which other political party is involved in Iraq and Yemen and Syria and Bahrain and Polisario and Kuwait? Which other party exports and produces Captagon by the tons? Which other none.
So
None.
I don't have any sympathy for Hezbollah.
No, I know you don't.
No,
I'm just saying
but
why I don't
I'm
like this
saying-
sentence.
No, of
because
course.
it's not true.
But assuming that we can, let's just say that they are the untouchable party. Below, I think, you may disagree with this, I think the access to corruption and the...
They cover each other up.
Yeah, and even those that may be slightly cleaner were also at least willing to take part in that horrible state plunder. From the reformists in certain parties that eventually lost that battle to the very, very corrupt. I mean, in a way, knowing that certain members that have affiliation to Al-Kata'ib that were found corrupt were fired from the Kata'ib party. That's a good thing. But it exists.
But it exists in France,
Sure,
right?
sure,
I mean,
sure,
there's
yeah,
a minister
no,
who was
no.
imprisoned yesterday that
Sure.
served under Sarkozy. It exists in the States.
I completely agree.
Corruption is not endemic to Lebanon.
Of course, but
Impunity is endemic to
the
Lebanon.
future movement also did politics very comfortably with a group that was
Certainly.
killing its best and brightest. And Kata'ib is Sabatash Tishrin today. Before 2016, before 2015, I mean, I had an argument with Sami Jmail in his home, and I think it was early 2014, where he was still talking about how you need to be in the government to reform it. Al-Uwait
But it's a
made
question.
mistakes
You know, I
too.
used to have this conversation with
Yeah.
Dr. Shattah a lot.
Yeah.
How do you do it best? I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Do you have to be part of it to try and infuse change? Or can you do it from outside? Do you break everything down? Where do you start? I honestly, I have no answer to this, but these are questions that actually keep me up at night. My mother always says to me, if you had a magic wand, my mother was on the streets in October. She still is on the streets today. My mother is there every time anything to do with August 4th happens. In Adliya, she's there.
Yeah.
We were there yesterday in Babda for Firis Said, because again, who are Hezbollah to take Firis Said to court because he has an opinion?
Could we go there a bit? I don't know enough about him.
He tweeted.
So it's a tweet that implicated...
That they have something to do with August 4th.
Right. And he received a summons for... that was postponed.
Inciting for civil war.
And he was... And
Isn't that hilarious?
It was postponed. Is that right?
So yesterday we went and the judge said that because of a strike.
Yeah, right,
of
right.
Some
Yeah.
of the bodies of
Yes.
those who actually take notes, I think.
Mhm.
Well, I'm not sure I got it right, but it was postponed.
Okay.
And there was no date of postponement. So that's another...
Right. So that's December 2021. It is 16 years, almost 17 years since Arbatash Azar. He's one of the more vocal, one of the more principled leftovers
صح.
of the spirit. And he carved a space for himself. He walks in the mountains. He does these hikes.
But he's a mountain boy.
He's a mountain.
He comes from Artaba.
Yeah.
Artaba is a mountain place. And his brother always used to tell me, you can take, his brothers lived in the States and in the UAE and in Saudi, and he hasn't been around much. He always said to me, you can take the boy out of the mountain, but never the mountain out of the boy. So they are mountain boys, these boys.
But October 17 is young and dynamic, and it's youth-led still. I feel old sometimes when I talk to October 17 partisans. Faris Said is in his 60s, maybe? Okay, and he's largely left alone. There aren't many people like him left in that March 14 vigor.
There are some, but they're not as vocal or as known. Yeah.
Is this where March 14 is now? That it's become just... you hear about it when it's summoned. Otherwise, it's not part of the story anymore.
I like to think that none of these movements are part of the story anymore. I really think there's something new that is needed. I just hope that whatever it is keeps the essence of March 14th. Which in essence is what? Is a sovereign country, a single army, a prosperous country, where citizens actually are allowed to have a dignified life, and where safety is guaranteed.
Yeah.
Because that's what a country should bring its citizens.
Yeah.
So if, whatever you want to call it, let it be, it's going to become December 17 or October, whatever you want to call it. Let's call it Lebanon version, what version Apple are we now? What have you, right? If it has those components, it's fine with me, honestly. I think we have to come to terms that they've killed the best of March 14th. So, of course, March 14th can never be the same because it's amputated. March 8th cannot rule Lebanon because at least half, if not more, of the country has an issue with the underlying principles of March 8th.
Yeah.
October 19th has failed at this point to actually provoke October 17th, Afwan, 2019, I mean, has failed to actually produce real change, right? Except for Saad Hariri, which if that's what it was about, I'm not sure. And so I think really what we need to say today, and I'm staying in Lebanon because I want to stay in Lebanon. It's a choice. It's a country. It's mine. My roots are here. My happiness is here, even without electricity and even with potholes. That's where I feel happy. Emotionally, I mean. So that's where I feel at peace myself, right? I've lived pretty much all over the world. This is where I want to stay if I can, and this is where I want to be, and if I can contribute in any way, and I do it by teaching and by forming new candidates to future elections. My condition is they're not allowed to be older than 30 because I think anyone above that is rotten already.
Thank you.
Not you. But I think that after 40 really you should just and there's so many young people with so many bright ideas and they're never heard because the youth somehow in Lebanon is never heard. So I've been spending a lot of time with youth lately, whether with foundations or at USG where I'm teaching, and it fills me with hope and joy. And I think we need to reinvent Lebanon. I really do. I think we need to reinvent Lebanon. But it has to be done on the basis of we are all under the same rule of law.
That is, I think, the ultimate goal that I think both of us may not live long enough to see. But I still think that we'll live long enough to see the turning of the page later. I think it is a matter of time because the seeds have been planted. For me, I'm not as... I still think of them as largely one and the same. March 14 protester and the October 17 protester, not the politicians. And October 17 doesn't really have real politicians yet. It hasn't been tested. But I think the aspirations overlap in most ways.
You're right.
Most ways.
You're right in many ways.
And
my only issue with a lot of it is that they're not very vocal about sovereignty. And I am obsessed with sovereignty because I think that if we had sovereignty, Hamad Shattah would be here with us. And so would all the others.
That's the divide, I think, that will determine the fate of October 17. And I think the narrative needs to stand corrected, that March 14 is not the same as March 8. And there's no shame in standing up for Lebanon's independence. So I want to thank you for spending quite a bit of time with me.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank you for squeezing in time when you're very busy towards this time of the year and going down memory lane in a very difficult way, very difficult terrain. It means a lot. Not many people can go down this road comfortably. So I hope it's the first of other conversations we have.
I'm sure.
And Asma, it stopped raining. So we're naturally over.
It was lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shattah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.